Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew bring you truthful, unbiased information about real agricultural concerns. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
Farmers have learned some hard lessons about water throughout the years. But how do we deal with modern water shortages? Drought is our topic today on Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
Servitech has been helping producers across the Midwest make the planet more productive since 1975. We are proud sponsors of Real Ag, helping tell the story of how your food makes it to your plate.
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
What is a drought?
Well, drought just in general is simply a lack of rainfall, lack of precipitation over an extended period of time. And it kind of accumulates. It's not something that happens quickly. You know, a natural disaster, you think about a tornado or a flood, something's going to come up really quick and go down really quick. And drought's really not like that. Drought's more of something that can build up over weeks, months, even years. But at the very basic, it's just not having as much rainfall as normal.
When you ask what is drought, the question has a difficult answer because it will depend upon what group you're talking to as to what constitutes a drought. And it will depend upon, for example, if you're looking at a water resource manager, a drought occurs when you start having limitations to your available water. If you're talking about a livestock producer, it may be when the ponds are getting low or where the pastures have dried up and are not available. If you're talking recreation, it may be when the lake levels are falling low enough so that you can't get your boat into the water. So again, a lot of difference as to how that drought might be determined by a particular group.
Oftentimes during drought we do experience some precipitation events or rainfall. The amount of those rainfall events, though, may not be adequate to actually fulfill the requirements of those plants for growth during that time period.
That's one of the questions that has come up quite frequently is, all right, we're in a drought, how do we know when we're out of a drought? The requirement to get out of a drought will depend upon what sector you're looking at. If you're talking about an annual crop like corn, if you have sufficient rain during a particular 2-month period, you don't have a drought anymore. Everything is fairly favorable. If you're talking about pasture situation, you may have rains, but if you had a 3-year drought, it may take another 3 years for the pastures to return to the condition that they were in before. And a lot of that will depend upon how well managed the pastures were before the drought developed. If you're talking about water supplies, again, how long does it take for that water source to recharge? And a single rain is unlikely to do that. And you may look at a flood in the middle of a drought. You may have one real intense rainstorm that produces urban flooding, but it doesn't resolve the underlying shortfall of moisture. It doesn't recharge the soil profile, and it's gone in a flash and downstream and no longer usable by the area that needs it.
Are there different stages of drought?
There are multiple stages of drought, primarily for response activity. There's not necessarily a set break point when you're talking about the on-the-ground impact that a farmer or even somebody in the city would see. But the multiple stages of drought are really trying to categorize what is going to be our response to that drought. We have the watch, the warning, and then the emergency. And most of our cities have drought emergency plans that mirror that as well. At the national level, primarily through USDA, but our drought at the national level is monitored, as you might expect, through National Weather Service and NOAA. They really have 5 stages, anywhere from abnormal drought to exceptional. And so again, that kind of helps to classify when is appropriate for different levels of government entities to really take action to try and mitigate the effects of drought.
Droughts do have a sequence of events that happen. The first thing that usually occurs is that we experience a meteorological drought, which is basically a reduction in precipitation that falls. That lack of precipitation then affects other things. It reduces plant growth and crop growth, and so we'll have an agricultural drought. And beyond that, if the drought persists longer, we even go into what could be called a hydrological drought, where streams are affected with low water flows, reservoirs will have lower levels, and aquifers can also be reduced in the amount of water that they have in them.
What are the impacts of drought?
First and foremost, drought has an effect on crops just because of you're typically not going to get as much rain. It's usually going to be hotter, and so our crops are going to dry up. I mean, you're going to go drive by fields, you're going to see the noticeable effects of maybe the crop's not as tall, the leaves are curling up. The long-term impact of that, even over a season really, is we don't get as much production. Not as much crop, whether that's corn, milo, wheat, whatever. The yield is really going to be down quite a little bit. And so it's just like a house plant. If you don't water it, over time that dries up and your plant's going to die, and that same thing will happen to our crops as well.
Plants need water in order for their cells to divide and to grow. And without that water being available, those plants are not going to be able to undergo that process. So the first thing affected is plant growth and dry matter accumulation.
If you're talking about a longer period, for example, if you're looking at pasture, which is not an annual but a seasonal production, you may have slower or lower growth, you may have less vegetation produced. When you're talking about livestock impacts on drought, a lot of it's going to be in the available resources for that animal. Are the pastures reduced in capacity, so you've got fewer numbers that you can have on there? Water quality may become an issue. What are the stock ponds like? As those stock ponds are reduced in size, you may have more problems with algae blooms or a low water quality.
There are some water quality issues that come with drought. Most notably see at our federal reservoirs, we see blue-green algae popping up. And really what that is, there's a number of factors that go into a blue-green algae bloom happening, but the food for it is nutrients that come off of the land surface. Those accumulate over time, and really what we have in a drought is we don't get as much water moving through, and so you get somewhat of a stagnant water supply, as you might imagine. We've seen that in recent years in a number of our federal reservoirs. And as that nutrient kind of sits there and our water temperature heats up, it really becomes prime opportunity for that algae to really bloom and really causes a lot of problems at our recreational issues primarily, but also from water supply as well. For our cities that draw directly from those reservoirs, what we've seen in recent years is those cities have had to implement new treatment technologies, spend dollars that maybe they would have spent somewhere else, making sure that that water is safe and tastes good also.
It's a big effect on the cattle numbers across the nation. It's shortened up the supply. You know, a lot of producers had to sell off at least part of their herd because of feed costs and dry pasture conditions. So that shortened up the calf crop. It shortens up the yearling crop.
I think what we first and foremost see with livestock and drought is just the need to haul water. We see a lot of our producers that will need to bring water into their cattle. And if we have multiple years of drought, what we see is our cattle herds, the numbers going down. There's just not the ability of our state and our hauling capacity really to support the significant amount of animal agriculture we have if we don't have water. And so what we see, and we have 2, 3, 4 years of drought in a row, is that our overall cattle numbers go down. Stockmen will go and sell off part of of their herd?
Well, when you look at the drought and the impacts on soils, a lot of it will depend upon how extended that drought is and how long that it persists. But you can get changes in the soil chemistry, changes in the not the plant, but the biotic material that's in the plant, what kind of organisms that are living in that. As it dries out, that will change, and so it may take time for those soils to recover. The other thing is that it makes it, particularly in parts of Kansas where we have soils that are vulnerable to erosion, if that soils dry out, particularly if you have a lot of freeze-thaw cycles in the wintertime, that can break that soil structure down and make it more prone to blowing. When you have those drought conditions, you've got less vegetation that's staying in place to hold that.
And so that's where we really start to see end up with dust storms and soil moving, the ability of the soil to really not produce vegetation. And again, it kind of takes a few years for that soil to recover to really get that moisture back down in the soil, so it not only holds together but also can produce plants.
When we're talking about water sources, there's a wide range of water sources. In the eastern part of the state, most of the water sources are surface water supplies, rivers, streams, stock ponds, and our reservoirs such as Milford and Tuttle. As you get into western Kansas, more of that water is an underground source, although they do have reservoirs out there. In central Kansas, we have a number of underground water sources such as the Equus beds. Those tend to be recharged by rainfall and can withstand a drought period, and then we get into a rainy period and those are refilled. When you're talking about western Kansas, the primary source of water is the Ogallala Aquifer, and that's more of an archaic water source, and it is not recharged generally by rainfall. So when you are in a drought situation, the pumping demands in those areas can increase, and it can deplete that water source more rapidly than it might have otherwise. There are definitely political and legal ramifications for drought. One of the biggest comes in irrigation and in water rights, where you may have a junior water right and you're restricted in the availability of water. There are minimum desirable stream flow levels that have to be maintained, and that can cut back irrigation. And of course, we've had a number of lawsuits on the national level with Nebraska and Colorado for accessibility of water from the various sources that come through. And Kansas has won on those, but getting the situation resolved so those waters become available has taken longer. And those are cases that have been in the courts for 25, 30 years or more.
There's a heightened awareness of water resources and our need to protect our water resources, conserve them, and plan for them during drought. I think that's kind of a natural situation as we get lower and lower our water supply. People get more and more concerned about it. They want to make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing at the local, state, and federal level to make sure that we don't run out of water.
When you're talking about people, one of the big problems with, again, we've got the temperatures that are going to be higher. That's going to have a negative effect. But for producers in particular, it's going to be, how long is this going to last? How do I manage my operations so that I can weather this situation? When will the rains come? Will it come in time? Do I need to shift my planting regime or my planting cycle? And that's a lot of stress on an operator, and that goes on beyond just the producer but into the community around them. What's the farm income going to be like? Are they going to have the disposable income to buy the products that these towns sell? Because all of that ripples down. If you've got low production in agriculture, that means you're going to have lower tax dollars coming in. They're going to be spending less, so that's going to again cut the entire circle of the economy.
Water touches all of our lives every day. We wouldn't be here in Kansas or on the earth if we didn't have water available to us, and certainly that's not just humans. Every animal, every plant relies on water, as does every single industry we have. So I think Kansas has a pretty well operated system for managing that, but But as our water supply goes down, then everything that depends on water, plants, animals, our industry, our cities, every person, the ag industry, all of it depends on water, all of it gets affected by drought. And so trying to make sure we recognize that we try and manage that lack of water so that no one industry, no one group of users, no one area is affected to the point that it can't recover effectively is something we got to keep in mind as well.
How do we mitigate the effects of drought?
When you're talking about compensating for poor weather, it becomes rather difficult to manage. One of the things is that there's only so much you can do. You don't really know necessarily what's going to be coming. You've got forecasts, but those are of limited reliability. So some of the things that producers will do will be look at which varieties they plant so that it has a wider range of tolerance so that it can handle both a dry condition and a more favorable moisture pattern. They may change their planting strategies, so they may plant a little bit earlier or a little bit later so that when the crop is in its most vulnerable state, it will be in the most favorable weather pattern at that time. The selection of which crops we grow in the area, again, is geared towards which ones can handle the extremes that we see in Kansas. So that's why winter wheat is a very big crop in our region, because again, it can handle those extreme conditions. There's been a movement of going from corn to sorghum because sorghum is more drought tolerant and more heat tolerant, so it can handle the conditions with less demands than say corn would do. So again, it's looking at those strategies and finding out which plants and commodities will hold up to the conditions that we get. And one of the things in the agronomy department is the variety tests that they perform across the state so that producers can look and see what kind of performance does this particular variety have over time and over a range of weather conditions.
Drought really can't be prevented, but certainly we can mitigate the effects of it. And I think if you look at where our state is at today versus where we were at when the 30s drought started, night and day difference. Whether that's better management on our crop fields, of our crop residue, where we're not plowing up the fields so much so that we're conserving our moisture that's in the soil. We're making sure that we're not having soil that's blowing across the state and across the nation, where we're managing our irrigation and using irrigation, whether that's terraces, waterways to conserve our soil, whether that's farm ponds and watershed dams that help provide water supply for our livestock, our federal reservoirs that provide water supply for our cities, and our management of all those different resources is much better than it has been. So I think all of those things, as well as continuing to plan how do we reduce our usage as the drought continues, mitigate the effects of drought and help us get through it a lot better than we used to.
During drought, there's several things that producers can do to try to mitigate the effects of the drought. One of the first things that actually should be done is for producers to establish a moderate stocking rate on their pastures prior to drought.
Quite often, if you're talking livestock production, they're reducing the number of animals that they will put on their operation. If they've got it on pasture, they'll have fewer numbers so that they can maintain the condition of the pasture as best as possible.
You may not send cattle to the grass at all. The biggest thing in the Flint Hills country, it affects the amount of drinking water for the cattle more than anything, because the way the ranchers manage their ranches, there's almost always dry grass for them to eat. So if it's dry, you turn out on dry grass with a supplement, a protein cube or a syrup lick, something like that. You know, you can get along fine. If it comes later in the year, after you've had some spring rains, then it's pasture management as to whether when you gather the cattle off of the grass.
Having a moderate stocking rate going to enable those plants to be high in vigor and to allow some litter cover over the soil so that when rainfall does occur, it's able to penetrate into the soil and it's going to be preserved and not evaporate quickly.
Our farmers have done a really good job, I think, of implementing practices that have really limited the impact of drought and the impact of wind erosion. We have seen, still even today, when we have multiple years of drought, we still do see some of our sand dunes moving from time to time. But I think just our management of our crops and our management of our land is a lot better than it used to be.
What sort of data is used to study and mitigate drought?
We get data from a number of sources. The Kansas Water Office is charged by statute with monitoring drought conditions and then advising the governor and other agencies of when we need to do something. And so we get information from any number of sources you might imagine. Precip temperature from National Weather Service, from individual reporters is a key. We make sure we get information on stream flow from the U.S. Geological Survey, on soil moisture from the from NRCS, from it's a USDA agency, as well as any number of local entities. And all that kind of comes together both with us and also with the state climatologists, as well as the National Climate and Drought Monitoring Center in Nebraska. And we look at all those different things and try and make a determination of at what point are we moving into drought, and what are the impacts such that we need to be doing something.
We have weather records here at our research center that show that 1 out of every 5 years we have less than 75% of our average precipitation. Those weather records go back to 1868, and so we have a very long history of weather records here that show us that 1 out of every 5 years we do have a drought or experience a drought.
Scientists have a real fun challenge when we're trying to compensate for poor weather because, again, most of the scientific endeavors require field work, and so you're trying to mimic the kind of conditions that the producer will endure. And sometimes the questions that you're trying to answer is, you want to have more control over the weather than we actually have. So, for example, here at the university, we've got what's known as rainout shelters. So if we want to simulate drought and how plants will respond under drought, we've got this little shed that will roll over the plot at the first sign of rain and produce a dry condition. So we'll put up the umbrella and cover the plot until the rain goes away so that we can mimic drought even if we're in a wet pattern. But there's, again, limits to what you could do and how much that will influence the results that you're trying to study.
It's important for us to do research and to try to keep track of weather records and animal production and pasture production. That way we can come up with plans and come up with ways to try to reduce the effects of drought. We know that drought's going to occur, and by using this information we can try to come up with ways to try to reduce their effects or its effects as much as possible.
There's no one thing you can look at and say, are we in drought, are we not in drought? Because it's really looking at the impacts of that long-term lack of precipitation. They have to say that's what really defines what level of drought you're in. And it can be very different from one spot to another. We may have one stream in one part of the state that is still doing fine just because of either storage or the watershed, and right over the hill another stream is really hurting. It may have had very similar conditions. And you don't want to just say, well, has it rained the same amount, because the impact's not the same. And so you got to look at all those different factors and say, when do we really need to take action to really, again, mitigate the effects of drought and help people make it through.
That wraps up this episode of Real Ag. Remember, you can see every episode of this series by going to SmokyHillsTV.org. Until next time, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
Servitech has been helping producers across the Midwest make the planet more productive since 1975. We are proud sponsors of Real Ag, helping tell the story of how your food makes it to your plate.
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.